Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Beth Gerleva, and I am a professional development specialist with the New York State Midwest Region Early Childhood Family and Community Engagement Center. You may have heard my name before, as we previously held the contract as the Regional Early Childhood Direction Center. I have been with Monroe BOCES for the past 11 years, providing support to families and providers on the special education process. Previously to coming to Monroe One, I worked for over 20 years as a program administrator and a social worker at special education preschool programs. For over 30 years, the New York State Department has supported contracts that look at early childhood care and education. We provide information, support, and referral assistance to families and providers who may have concerns about a child with a known disability, possible delays in development, or may be at risk for a developmental delay. The Early Childhood FACE Center serves a multiple county region, which includes Genesee, Livingston, Monroe, Ontario, Seneca, Wayne, Wyoming, Yates, Steuben, Schuyler, and Cayuga counties. We're part of 14 Early Childhood FACE Centers across New York State, and we work with approximately 72 school districts within that region. Our services at EC FACE Center are free and are made possible by the New York State Education Department. And now I'll let Barb introduce herself.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad you joined us. My name is Barb Wisnowski, and I joined Monroe One BOCES in the early childhood support contracts in July of 2016. So I've been working with Beth for 4 years. My current title is Resource and Referral Specialist. So prior to joining Beth in 2016, I worked for more than 20 years in an early childhood agency where I was the coordinator of the Preschool Evaluation Center and the preschool counseling services provided by our agency, as well as our Head Start family support services. My background is really in school counseling, and I have a special interest in young children and the special education process. So in my role, I really helped families understand the New York State special education services, as well as helping them access supports from other community resources. So my background is really tied into my current role here. So I'm going to take us through the first part of the presentation, and then Beth's going to take us through the second part. So Beth, will you advance the slide for me, please? Difficult to see on the white background. So to better understand what to expect as a child moves on to kindergarten, we're going to talk about this transition time that's approaching. You know, the transition from preschool to kindergarten can be a time of excitement, but it can also be a source of anxiety for parents. It's a big change coming on. But transitions are made easier when families and providers understand the process. Our goal today is to help parents become more prepared by sharing some information in this presentation, as well as the handouts that Laura referenced. So you can see them on your screen there, and they're really geared for parent use, and we'll reference those throughout so you'll understand a little bit more about what those handouts are. What we hope to accomplish today to help participants understand is the transition process itself, how to be an active member of the transition team, understand some of the differences between the Committee on Preschool Special Education and the School Age Committee on Special Education, and understand the purposes of an IEP. Our hope is that parents and other participants will come away from this workshop with a better understanding of what to expect as children move on to kindergarten. Change is hard, and if you're not prepared, it's even harder. So much of today's presentation highlights the typical course of action that occurs. Given these uncertain times with the COVID-19 pandemic, and as things are changing from the governor's office and the executive orders, you know, weekly sometimes, we want to encourage all to reach out to school districts, to their particular school districts, for maybe particulars about specific school districts as they make decisions. So our goal today is really to give you the overview of how New York State education typically defines this process. Okay, Beth, next slide, please. So when a child has special needs, kindergarten planning can be lots of feelings, exciting and fun, challenging and overwhelming, scary and different. I'm sure that all that are on this call today, especially parents, have begun to think about what will be different. So some examples that Beth and I thought of are like school bus transportation. You know, in preschool, some parents drive their children to school. Others are picked up by smaller buses or vans in some counties. So now the big school bus comes into play a little bit more. The school day is longer oftentimes. The building is larger and the class sizes can often be larger. There are more school-wide assemblies and programs such as music and gym class. There's interactions with older students in the building, but there's also lots of new opportunities for children and parents. So as we think about this transition from CPSE to CSE, Committee on Preschool Special Education, to the Committee on Special Education, there's some thoughts or things that parents should be asking themselves. Will my child even continue to need special education services? During this process, some children are declassified and they move on to kindergarten just as a general ed student. Where will the child attend class? How many adults will be in the classroom? Are there any specialized equipment that will be needed for the child? And with regard to transportation on the larger school bus, is there a bus aid? And is the child going to receive summer services? So just some thoughts as you think about this transition process, or if you're a provider helping parents think about it, those are some guiding questions. One of the handouts that we've attached to this is called an All About Me publication, and that's really an outline publication that'll help parents even formulate their thoughts even more, put some thoughts in writing. Okay, Beth, next slide, please. So Beth and I wanted to talk a little bit about when will children go to kindergarten? You know, what are the regulations around that? So typically, children who will be 5 years of age on or before December 1st and are eligible to attend kindergarten starting in September of that school year. But we put a note. Each district may have their own requirements for age and cutoff dates. So you want to be sure as a parent to contact the school district for their specific district policy. Typically in this area, the December 1st cutoff date is what's used, but in other parts of the state, a December 31st cutoff date is used. So in essence, the New York State Education Department rule is December 1, but a school district's Board of Education can make their own decision to change the age and date. In those districts which use a later cutoff date, the later date is used to determine the last date of eligibility for preschool special education and the first date for kindergarten eligibility for that school year. Children who will turn 5 after a district's cutoff are considered preschoolers for an additional school year and are eligible to be evaluated and receive services through the Committee on Preschool Special Education. Such a child would be deemed a preschool child through the month of August of the school year in which he first becomes eligible to attend school. New York State Education on their website has some guidance documents. So one of those guidance documents is called the Evaluation of 3- and 4-year-old Children Suspected of Having Disabilities. So there's more information that can be found on the New York State Education website for both providers and parents. So that may be something a parent might want to look at sometime. Just get on that website and take a look around and see what documents might be helpful in understanding the process even more. If a parent decides not to send their child to kindergarten because of a fall birthday or a later in the year birthday, because they don't feel the child's ready, the Committee on Special Education Services would then take place at the school building, and you as the parent would need to transport your child to the school district for their services. So kindergarten in and of itself is not mandatory. Special education under the CSE, if a child is eligible, is required, but the parent must make their child available for those services in essence. Okay, Beth, next slide, please. So how does a parent prepare for their CPSE and CSE meeting? First of all, you want to make sure you're an active participant in your meeting and you want to be fully present. So if this meeting's been scheduled and you are not able to make the meeting date, time, or location, you want to contact that chairperson immediately and request that that meeting be rescheduled so that you can really be an active partner in that meeting. Then a parent might want to review past preschool reports and individual education program plans, as well as consult with their child's current service providers from preschool regarding their child's progress, strategies they've used, and areas of continued need. So what do those folks that have been working with this child know about this child to add to those thoughts that you're compiling as a parent that you're going to help present at the CSE meeting? You want to make sure you've obtained copies of all the materials that are going to be used at the meeting. You want to read through them and make sure you understand these documents. And if you have questions, you want to reach out to the CSE chair or other professionals to make certain you understand before the meeting so you don't feel like you're going into the meeting unprepared. You should also be prepared as a parent to share information about your child, asking questions. You're an active and full partner in this process. So write down, as I suggested, write down any questions that you have and bring them to the meeting so you can remind yourself of the things you wanted to ask or the things you wanted to share. You might want to invite someone else to attend the meeting with you who can listen and provide reminders about what you want to say. Sometimes in the moment, you think you're prepared, you walk in, and then you feel a little nervous or a little anxious. So having another trusted adult with you can be a little bit of a security and a team approach into this. Sometimes it's both parents going in, sometimes it might be a friend or a neighbor or another relative. You want to identify what you believe will support the child's growth and development. You want to think about what you would like others to know about this child, your child. These things might be some things you want to consider in sharing. What are your child's strengths? What have you as the parent discovered works for your child? You live with this child 24/7. So you really know your child better than anyone. You know ways that your child learns, and you know how to read your child's cues. So those are some important aspects to share at a CSE meeting or a CPSE meeting, because those sitting around the table may not be as familiar with your child as you are. So that All About Me handout, again, I just want to reference that several times, can be a helpful guide to begin to formulate your thoughts and put them in one place so that they're handy for you. Okay, Beth, next slide, please. So at the last preschool special education meeting, these are the items on the slide are what's going to be discussed. They're going to look at the yearly progress. They call this the annual review. What's that last year in preschool? You know, what are the gains? What progress has this child made? You're going to determine whether this child is going to go to summer school, the extended school year, as a preschooler, so that July-August timeframe. You're going to determine whether the child will be declassified or whether they're going to be referred on to the Committee on Special Education, the school age committee. So before the child's annual review, often school district personnel may visit a child's program. So again, in these times of COVID, children haven't been attending in person, so that those visits may not have happened this year. But typically, some school district personnel would go out to those preschool programs, talk to the providers, and just take a look to see how this child was performing either in their classroom or in their therapies. Then during the meeting, the team will review the progress towards the goals and make recommendations for the support and services they may need in the next school year. Parents, again, should be a part of this discussion that leads to this recommendation, and they should feel comfortable about the recommendation. So if there's a discomfort with what's being recommended, again, encourage asking questions so that you understand as a parent why these recommendations were being made. The purpose of the CSE meeting is really to determine eligibility for school age support services. If a student is referred to the CSE and the CSE determines an evaluation is needed, it's the responsibility of the CSE to get that consent. So once the referral's been made from CPSE committee to CSE, the CSE has to look at what do we need to determine this. In order to provide you with a deeper dive into what goes into the last CPSE meeting, the other handout that you see listed on the screen and that you have access to is preparing for your IEP meeting. So that may give you some more in-depth information about the meetings. Okay, Beth, next slide, please. So what are the responsibilities of the CSE team now, the school age team? So now our preschool providers aren't present. We're really, as a parent, in a meeting with the school professionals, the school age professionals. So the visual representation on the slide really outlines the steps that may be taken as you near your first CSE meeting, excuse me. Once the CSE has received the referral, they will review and consider evaluations and progress reports from the child's preschool teachers and therapy providers. They will determine what, if any, assessments need to be conducted for the reevaluation and schedule a meeting to determine the eligibility for programs or services under CSE school age. They will obtain consent from the parent for any new or additional evaluations. Sometimes some of the records from preschool are older evaluations, and the CSE may think, these aren't reflective of a child. You know, this evaluation might have been done when a child was 3 years old. Now they're 5. Boy, what growth have they really made? Let's do some more testing to really update the record. As I mentioned earlier, school personnel may observe the child in their current educational setting in preschool. Really, the purpose of the CSE meeting is to determine the child's eligibility for school-age special education services, and they are the committee that will develop the IEP and determine those programs and services with parents as an active member. To qualify for school-age special education programs and services, the CSE must determine that a child meets criteria for one of 13 specific categories or classifications. So in preschool, the classification for every child in preschool CPSE services was preschool student with a disability. Now, as we approach school age, there's specific categories, and Beth is going to cover those 13 specific categories in a few moments. Some additional requirements to be aware of are that there should be 2 different meeting notices sent, one for the CPSE meeting, the final CPSE meeting, and one for the CSE meeting. So these are separate committees and separate meetings, and that shouldn't all be lumped together. For parents, it should be clear what's about to happen and who's going to be present. In some districts, though, the CPSE and the CSE chairperson is the same person, and in some school districts they are different. So it depends on the size of the school district and how many administrators they have involved. So you may be working with the same chair, but your committees will look different. Okay, Beth, next slide. So here we wanted to talk a little bit about who are the Committee on Special Education team members. Similar to the Preschool Special Education Committee, the members are multidisciplinary. You as the parent are by law equal partners in the child's IEP team. I've mentioned this several times, and I really want to reinforce that for parents, because I think parents sometimes go into these meetings feeling like the professionals at the table know more than they do, and that's not often the case. The CSE chairperson is a district representative who facilitates the discussion and must be knowledgeable about the services, the special education services in the school district. A school psychologist who assesses the child who will interpret the results for the committee. So testing information yields a lot of jargon sometimes, and so their job is really to break it down so that all members of the committee understand the results of any testing or any review of records, so that it's in plain English. We know what this child's strengths and needs are. A special education teacher assists with decisions about supports, services, curriculum modification, and goal setting. So that's their role on the committee. A general education teacher will participate, especially if this child's going to be in a general education classroom. They understand typical development, and they help guide that discussion about what are some of the differences and what does this child need. A parent member may be requested by a parent in writing with at least 72 hours notice before the meeting. So that parent member is another parent in the district who has a child in the CSE process and understands, maybe is more of a veteran parent. For children transitioning into kindergarten, this is still a fairly new process for many parents. So a veteran parent might help guide those discussions or ask questions that a newer parent might not think to ask. And they also understand some of the procedures and can help clarify some information. I can remember sitting in meetings often, and those of us as educators slip back into our education lingo, and we forget sometimes. We use acronyms and abbreviations when we need to spell out. So the parent member was always a good reminder when we fell into that. Other participants might include a school social worker, related service providers, school physicians, or anyone else who has special knowledge of the child being discussed. Now I want to turn it over to Beth, who's really going to talk about the eligibility determination and why the classification is needed.
Great, thanks, Barb. Okay. Once the child transitions to kindergarten, the eligibility criteria for special education services changes from what was utilized in preschool. So if providers or parents remember, in preschool, the criteria was for eligibility a 12-month delay in one or more developmental areas, a 33% delay in one area, or a 25% delay in two developmental areas, or a score of 2 standard deviations below the mean in one area, or 1 standard deviation below the mean in 2 areas. So let's refresh again what those developmental areas are. It's motor, cognitive, language and communication, adaptive, social emotional / behavior, and physical. However, this is no longer the criteria that's being used. The eligibility criteria for the Committee on Special Education is defined by New York State as a child with a handicapping condition who has not attained the age of 21 prior to September 1st and is entitled to attend public schools. 2, a child who, because of mental, physical, or emotional reasons, has been identified as having a disability and requires special services and/or programs. If you, the committee, and the committee decide that your child does not require special education services or programs, as Barb said, they may not qualify for school-age services and move right into a regular kindergarten classroom. The committee will provide you with information indicating why the child is ineligible. If the child is ineligible for CSE services, they may be eligible for other services identified on the left side of the slide. So these may be some terms that parents are not familiar with. They're brand new. So possible services include a 504 referral, academic intervention services, or what the school calls AIS, behavioral support or social programs, and they could look more like a lunch bunch or a friendship group that happens during the school day. The school may be also increased what we call tiered support to supplement skill development, and we call that an RTI process. Or then there might be reading intervention or remedial instruction. So the child throughout the day may go to a reading group and leave the classroom and work with a reading teacher on specific identified skill development. So if the child is ineligible for school-age services, we really encourage parents to reach out to their principal and discuss the possible supports on the slide that may be available to that child during that first year of kindergarten. I know that some school districts also offer additional support through related services that they just kind of, and some school districts call it like early intervention. So I can remember that my daughter, I have a set of twins, and both of them received services in preschool. And when they were getting ready to transition to kindergarten, they were not eligible based on the classification determination for school-age services, but the school still felt they needed some support. And one of the areas that my one daughter needed support was in occupational therapy. She had low trunk control. She had difficulty with fine motor skills. And so they included her in an OT group. So twice a week, she went with other students and they practiced fine motor skills, and they did games around that. The OT would just generally jump into the classroom, check her handwriting, gave the teacher some alternative seating strategies. She used a T-stool to help her core body strength, but she didn't have an IEP, but she still was able to receive some supports that they still provide in kindergarten. If the committee decides your child is eligible for special education services, the committee must identify the one disability category that most appropriately describes the child. The determination of a disability category is used solely for eligibility purposes and does not prescribe the program or services the child would receive. The committee will develop and implement an IEP with recommended programs and services based on the student's unique needs as a result of the student's disability. Classifications are a descriptor of the child's area of need, not a description of who the child is. Remember, as Barb mentioned previously, the classification that the child has is a preschooler with a disability, and now they are transitioning to kindergarten and determined eligible for CSE services. Their classification will change. This slide identifies 13 classifications for a student with a disability at school age, as determined by the New York State Education Department. One of these classifications may align with the child's identified diagnosis or disability, such as autism, deafness, or visual impairment. If a classification does not align exactly with the child's diagnosis or disability, the committee, for which the parent is a member and has the opportunity to discuss and share, will determine a classification which best aligns with the child's identified educational needs. So a child may be determined eligible based on their needs, and it's the committee's recommendation that they are determined eligible and develop an IET, then the committee must try and figure out, based on the information presented, which classification works best for that child. The classification identified by the CSE committee may stay the same throughout the child's school years, but it can also change depending on the specific situation of the child or how that child's needs change over time. So why do we have to have a classification? For children ages 5 through 21, they need special education service. A specific classification is required because that's what New York State education tells us. So we encourage all parents to understand the definition of each New York State classification as defined by Part 200 regulations of the Commissioner. So each one of these classifications has a specific definition. We want families to be knowledgeable about the definition of each classification. So when they go into that meeting and the committee says, I think we need to identify a classification of other health impaired, that the family knows what that definition is ahead of time. They can have time to process that information. They can look at their own child's evaluations. As Barb said, they should have access to all their children's evaluations and progress reports and quarterly reports to understand what their child's needs are. And they can make a determination of, yes, whether they agree with that classification, or maybe they want to have a discussion with the committee that there might be another classification that they feel aligns best with their child's needs. One of the things we want families to recognize is that while the child may meet the definition for more than one classification, say that the child has autism, but also has a visual impairment, blindness, they could be identified under any one of those categories. But we can only choose one classification for determining eligibility for CSE. So while a child may qualify under a multiple of those, the committee must choose the one that best aligns with that child's needs. So families will be able, to find the definitions of each classification on the New York State Education Department website. The definitions are in 200 regulations. The first 5 pages of the 200 regulations are the classifications and their definitions. And so we encourage families to be able to seek out that information. The link for that website is on your resources at the end of the PowerPoint. So as providers, I encourage you to also look at that and know the definitions that families will be presented with, and then encourage families and send families those links so that they have that information also. As we said before, it's important to remember that the classification does not determine the type or level of services a child may or should receive. The IEP is developed to work on the child's specific goals. So the classification is to determine eligibility. The IEP is to support the needs and services or programs that have been recommended from the committee. We also want parents and providers to think of the child as a child first, and remind others of that often. So the classification doesn't define the child when they enter school age, it's a means to the end. So the IEP. After the child has been determined eligible, the CSE will use the results of the child's evaluation, past reports, preschool IEPs, as well as consult with the preschool provider team regarding student progress, strategies, and areas of continued need. This information will be critical to develop an IEP for the child for school age. This documentation will assist the CSE committee to identify the child's strengths and struggles. Having that information allows the team to provide the individualized instruction and supports the child will need in kindergarten. The development of the IEP includes several key pieces of information, and they are: the first is the present level of educational performance, which we often call the PLEPS. This describes the child's current abilities and where the child is in functioning, often talked about as a baseline. The IEP identifies needs or skill delays, strengths, preferences, and the interest of the child. It also incorporates parents' concerns. It is so important to note that the parent should have the opportunity to share their thoughts and concerns about their child, which will then be included when developing the IEP. The IEP will also develop measurable annual goals, which are a component of the IEP. And that's what the child works on all year long, just like they did in CPSE. However, we want parents to be aware that when the child enters into school age, only annual goals are identified on the IEP. When a child was in preschool, the IEP identified an annual goal and then either objectives or benchmarks that the child was working on to achieve that annual goal. Once the child goes to kindergarten, there are no longer any identifiable objectives or benchmarks attached to the annual goal. Also included in the IEP are recommendations about special education programs, supplementary aids and services, program modifications and accommodations, assistive technology, and supports for school personnel on behalf of the student. These supports for school personnel on behalf of the student are services the child's teacher, related service provider, or teacher aides may need. The supports may include, but are not limited to, training on a specific disability such as autism, on assistive technology the child utilizes, behavior intervention, or health and medical interventions. We always want parents to be prepared as they're going into this meeting, just like Barb had talked about before. And so some questions that we want parents to think about as they participate in the development of their child's IEP is: how are my child's strengths incorporated into the program? How will I know my child is progressing? When will I receive written reports about my child's progress? How will my child's program and services be coordinated? And most importantly, how can I support my child's educational program? In the handouts that Barb's talked about previously, there is a handout called Understanding the IEP. So if we have professionals on the training today, please take a moment to look at that so that you can better understand the IEP process if you're not sure, but also use this document to pass on to families so that they have a foundational understanding of the IEP so that when they go into their future meetings, they can be more educated on that special education process and what the purpose of the IEP is for. Least restrictive environment. One of the biggest decisions that the CSE committee makes when creating an IEP is what type of learning environment the child will be in. Schools are required to place students with IEPs in the least restrictive environment, or what we often refer to as LRE. In basic terms, LRE refers to the setting where a child with a disability can receive an appropriate education designed to meet his or her educational needs along peers without disability to the maximum extent appropriate. Based on a child's individual needs, the committee is required to consider providing services from least to most restrictive. Least restrictive environment is part of the federal mandate Individuals with Disability Act, or IDDA. The least restrictive environment must provide the special education needed by the student and provide for education of the student to the maximum extent appropriate to the needs of the student with other students who do not have disabilities. So the next component is looking at the school-age programs and services. When a student goes to kindergarten, there are various kindergarten classroom options depending on the school district in which the parent resides. New York State Education Department indicates that school districts must offer a continuum of classroom options for children with IEPs. However, they do not dictate that the school district must offer all identified classroom options at each grade level. Classroom options are determined by the grade level need and may change each year as the needs of the students change. However, the following kindergarten options may be available at the parent's school district. I encourage all parents to discuss with the committee which options may be available to their child in September. So let's kind of mention what those options might look like. So you can have a general education kindergarten classroom with related services such as speech, OT, PT, as indicated on the IEP. You can have a general education kindergarten classroom with a consultant teacher, and that teacher supports the student or the regular education teacher. You can have a co-taught kindergarten classroom that has both a special education and a general education teacher and other support services as needed by the child. You can have a special class with a special education teacher, and the class is comprised of only students who have disabilities, as well as other support services needed by those children. So let's discuss more specifically the options under CSE. And the options that we're going to talk about are moving from least restrictive to most restrictive. So that least restrictive model would be a consultant teacher. And this is when a special education teacher provides direct in the classroom and teaches the student directly. Or there's indirect support to the student by assisting the student's other teachers to adjust the learning environment and or modify instructional methods to meet individual needs of that student. Consultant teacher services can be a combination of direct and indirect services for a minimum of 2 hours per week. We also have a resource room, which requires that the student receives no less than 3 hours of instruction weekly and shall not spend more than 50% of their time during the day there. The group size is not to exceed 5 students, and the composition of the group is based on students that have similar individual needs. Consultant teacher can be provided in combination with research room for students who do not need the 2 hours of consultant teacher and 3 hours of resource room. The IEP must be specific about the service combination, and there is a minimum of 3 hours per week. Next, we have the integrated co-teaching model, which requires both a special education and general education teacher to co-teach. This is the only service that is not mandated to be available and offered by school districts. No more than 12 students with disabilities in the class, and the number of non-disabled students should be more than or equal to the number of students with disabilities. Teacher assistants and aides cannot be used in place of the special education teacher within the classroom. The last one is our special class. The special class is a class of students with disabilities grouped together because of similar needs for the purpose of being provided specially designed instruction, and we call that SDI. Class size may vary, and adult to student ratio must be indicated on the IEP. For example, you could have a class size that's a 15-1, a 12-1-1, an 8-1, and so on. These numbers represent how many students and adults will be in the classroom. The age range for students under 16 years of age shall not exceed 36 months. So everyone in that classroom has to be within 3 years of each other in age. The class must include a certified special education teacher or a certified reading teacher for students grouped for reading needs. And all or part of that day must be specified on the IEP. Related services. The related services identified in the slide are not a finite list. The IEP will indicate the location of services, whether they're in the classroom or outside the classroom, whether it's provided in a group or individually, the duration of how long the session will be, the frequency, how often the session will occur, and are all determined at the CPSE meeting. If determined services will occur in a group, the maximum group size is 5 students. And the related services for students are varied and individual. Some students may need many related services. Other students may only need one. It's based on their individual needs. So parental rights. Often professionals get busy with their day-to-day job responsibilities and make assumptions that parents know as much as they do about the special education process. It is important to remember, as a member of the CSE, the parents have the following rights identified on the slide. They have the right to be fully informed, to be notified about all meetings at least 5 school days before the meeting, participate in the decision-making, have all information explained, and as Barb mentioned before, request a change in meeting date, time, and location, have their confidentiality maintained, and be able to review all school records, including any data collection records, reports, or evaluation for the child. We want to encourage parents, if they have concerns about the child's educational program, to discuss these concerns with appropriate staff at the school district. If they disagree with the evaluation results or other proposed action of the committee, such as the recommendation, the placement, or implementation of the program, they should express their concerns. By clearly sharing their concerns and the reasons for their concerns, they are making sure that the other members of the committee understand their point of view. Parents should try to work out differences informally with the school district as soon as they happen. We encourage parents to ask for a meeting to talk in person or schedule a phone conference to discuss the concerns with the child's teacher, related service provider, principal, chairperson, or the instructional support team. As Barb mentioned before, write down what was discussed at the meeting, the staff that are present, steps identified to resolve the concern. If necessary, the parent should request a follow-up meeting within a reasonable amount of time to revisit the concerns and ensure that the steps identified were implemented as planned. I encourage all families and service providers to print out this parents' rights slide. I think that if they have this accessible to them and review it in preparation for every CSE meeting, they'll better be able to develop a plan that meets their needs in addition to their child's. Making the home to school connection. It's important that the child has some familiarity with their new school. The parents should be excited for this next phase in their child's life because the child will feel the excitement too. Here are some suggestions for ways to make a good home-school connection on the slide. And we encourage parents to reach out and attend any kindergarten orientations, participate in kindergarten screenings, make an appointment to take a school tour. I know that some schools are doing virtual tours right now for their kindergarten students. Request an opportunity to see the classrooms. Invite school personnel to visit their child at their daycare or their nursery school or their preschool program. And inquire about the school procedure regarding meeting with the kindergarten teacher in advance. Maybe a Zoom can happen with the teacher so that the child gets some familiarity and puts a name to a face. Parent and professional partnerships are so important. Communicating openly and honestly so that collaborative communication occurs, planning together and sharing in the responsibility for assuring a quality education for the child is part of that partnership. Respecting one another's opinion and knowledge is critical to developing an effective and collaborative partnership. We want everyone to remember, parent or practitioner or school district, together you are in this for the benefit of the child. This is a list of resources in addition to the handouts that we provided. The first is the New York State Education Department website, where you can find the 200 regulations and a list of the definitions for the classifications. And then the next one is a resource to special education supports services from birth to third grade. This is a great resource for families and also practitioners. Barb and I want to thank you for participating. We're available to practitioners and families up until the time that the child transitions into kindergarten. At that time, once the child is school age, New York State has a partner network with us. So we're the Early Childhood Family and Community Engagement Center, but there's also the School Age Family and Community Engagement Center. And we've identified for you, Jennifer Casiopo and Laura Hurwitz, who have the same positions that Barb and I do with their contact information. So once the parent gets to school age and may have questions, or service providers might need to reach out to ask some questions possibly for parents or gain some more information, that's where you can go for that school age connection. And then I guess we'll open it up to if anyone has any questions or thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Beth and Barbara, for that very informative webinar. That was great information. We have a few questions, but we have also time, so feel free while I'm asking these if you want to type your questions in the chat pane. So one of the questions, or actually I should say several, so I'm kind of lumping these all together, so I hope this is helpful. Can you address the issue of families feeling nervous about sending their child? Maybe they feel there were some not emotionally ready or mature enough to go to kindergarten, but they still need services and they want to still get those services. So I'm wondering if you could kind of speak to that.
So I guess some clarification, Laura, is do you get a sense that the child is going to kindergarten, is not being determined eligible for services, but still has some delays?
Not for this one. Actually, that's going to be the next question actually, that they have. So this one sounds like, or I'm going to say these few questions sound like they're a student who needs, maybe still needs services through an IEP, but they feel that they're not mature. There was one where they had a young birthday. So they're going to kindergarten and they're 4, and feel kind of like they have to go to kindergarten, but they need the supports and services.
So in that situation, I would do, and Barb can talk about this also, do a lot of pre-work with your service providers that you have in preschool to really outline specifically what the child's needs are in certain environments, in different situations, so that the CSE committee gets a true understanding of the child in various environments, right? Because we know that in a small group or a one-to-one setting, that child may be more confident, may show increased strengths in areas. But when they get into a large group, they kind of back away. They have behaviors, if you will, that exhibit themselves because there's some anxiety, or they're not sure how to function socially, or they're lacking some communication skills to be able to engage in the group. We really want to make sure that all of those scenarios are presented to the committee so that you can accurately provide supports for that child when they enter kindergarten. Because maybe if we don't talk about that, counseling as a related services maybe have left off the IEP because we're only describing the child in a one-to-one situation. So the child looks confident, they're engaging, they're using their words. And so counseling or social skills group, social skills stories may not be needed in that one-to-one, but it's definitely going to be needed in a larger group. So I think as much pre-work as you can do. I think this is when we talked about inviting the school district personnel to come visit your child in that large group setting over periods of time, not for a half hour, over multiple days at different times of activities, getting off the bunch, lunch, free play, to get a really good idea of how your child engages in that school environment.
Yes, and Beth, I would just add to that, that's where I was trying to highlight, maybe too briefly, that parent voice. So what are your concerns as a parent about sending the child to kindergarten? They're by law, they're kindergarten age eligible, so preschool can't continue. That's not an option under New York State education regulations. But you as a parent or a provider helping a parent can really highlight what are the concerns, what do you as the parent see as the barriers for that kindergarten. That's part of that open discussion so that the school district or the educational organization can say, oh, well, this is how we handle it. And we have other children who are in the similar situation. So this is how we accommodate or we provide these extra supports. So those are all good discussion points. In the end, it is a parent's decision to make whether they go on to kindergarten or not. But I really would encourage parents to really highlight that those questions or concerns at meetings and in discussions with the chair and preschool providers, so that everybody's got a good picture of this child, so that they can write that individual education program that would meet the needs.
Thank you so much. I think, and the next question is kind of, you've already answered it, but if you want to add on, someone's concerned their child was declassified, they're going to kindergarten, and they feel that they're just not ready for kindergarten.
So I would encourage the same thing. So having those pre-dialogues with your district personnel, your principal, the CSE chairperson, as we talked on the one slide about those alternative supports that are being offered within your district that your child may benefit from and engage in, and really highlight why those are important. Like, if it's a social component, do they have a lunch bunch? Do they have a girls group? Do they have a social skills group that your child can participate in? If you're noticing that they don't qualify specifically for fine or gross motor, but they're having trouble with fine motor and writing, a lot of schools offer programs like writing with no tears. And so there may be programs that are available, but parents need to really start asking those questions. What else is available? Why couldn't my child be a participant in a group? Why couldn't the OT come and just check in with the teacher to see if there's some modifications about seating, things like that to help the child within their classroom setting?
Right, and I would add to that, often when I sat in meetings, I would hear parents ask those specific questions or raise those concerns, especially when their child was going to be declassified because they didn't meet those criteria for the 13 eligibility areas. And the school districts would say, oh my gosh, well, here's our menu on what we call the general education side of things. So that slide highlighted some of those supports, but often school districts have a full menu of these interventions or these supports that don't need an IEP in order for them to offer to children. Their job is they want children to be successful and they're going to try to support. So again, having those full conversations might bring out things that you're not aware of. Those systems aren't in place in preschool. So that's one of the big differences between preschool and school age services are the range of opportunities that a child can access to support their growth and development.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what if my child no longer needs all services? So right now, it looks like they're going to get OT and speech. Do they still need an IEP?
Well, that depends on all the information that's brought and reviewed, like Barb discussed, to the Committee on Special Education. So it may be that with some of the things that we talked about available in general education, they might not need an IEP, but they may meet the criteria under those 13 classifications. And so they were determined eligible, and then they would develop an IEP with only related services on it. So the child would go to the general education kindergarten classroom, and on Mondays and Wednesdays at 9, maybe the OT pushes in because that's when they're starting their writing. And so the OT would push in, support, give suggestions to the teacher. Then maybe one's a group session. So they leave the classroom on Wednesday at 9 and go with 3 or 4 other kids and do some work on strength and conditioning. So it really does depend on what those evaluations and the information brought to the committee on which way that will go.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what do I do if my child is being declassified and I disagree? What would be my next steps?
So I think that one of the things is really, as we talked about a partnership and we talked about the school district, I would take you back to, do you have all the information? Have you been able to review all the reports? Do you have access to all the information that is being presented to the Committee on Special Education? Do you understand the information that is in the report? Go back and look at, now that we've talked about eligibility determination in school age, the 13 classifications and those definitions. Based on those definitions, can you identify a classification that your child would fit? Talk to the chairperson ahead of time. What might they be seeing in the reports of the evaluation that you're not seeing? Maybe you have information on parental concerns that we talked about that haven't been yet shared with the committee. So how can you share those with them? So it should be a dialogue, a communication, to be able to make sure you're all looking at the information and understanding each other's point of view.
And Beth, I would add to that, do you remember the point that we had to make, we made, that the school district is really obligated to consider least restrictive environment. So when we think about those other kinds of supports under general education, like a 504 plan, which identifies some accommodations and modifications for a student or a child, those academic intervention services, the reading intervention, remedial instruction, behavioral supports, those might be what the school district is obligated to try to support this child so that they are in a least restrictive environment. IEP in general terms, is more restrictive. So if the school district has those menu of supports that they can offer, they're really obligated to do that first.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. And that kind of leads into the last question that we have that says, why would the school ask the parents to change the child's IEP classification?
So it may be that the needs of the child have changed. And so maybe that there is a child with multiple diagnoses that could fit under multiple classifications. And as that child moves through their school years, their needs change. And so when you're looking at the child's needs and strengths and the annual goals, the child's needs areas really may be more highlighted in one of those classifications. And so it may change. And so we just don't want to have parents assume that that diagnosis will be the same, or that classification will be the same throughout. So one of the areas that you can think about is that you may have a child who does have a diagnosis of autism, and they have that autism classification. But as they go through school, their needs in that area may change, and there may be some other comorbid diagnoses, anxiety, depression, and things of that nature, where it might be other health impaired. And so we just don't want families to recognize that once you get a diagnosis, and then it may be identified with a classification, that classification would go all the way through, because it may not, because by virtue of the individual education program, that classification has to be individualized to that student based on the needs and the skill set areas that have been identified to require special education supports and services.
Right, and I think that's why school districts have to provide what they call an annual review. So at least once a year, the team, with the parent being the member of the teams, needs to sit down and look at what progress has this child made, what needs are there, and what do we see as we develop this program going forward. So that review really is part of that discussion. You can think about your child in terms of, as they were in that birth to 5-year range, how much they changed. Well, children continue to grow and develop and change. And sometimes, we need to update that information so that it's a more accurate picture. The idea behind the program is to present a really good, accurate picture of this child, the whole child, in regards to all of their strengths and needs and skills, etc.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth and Barbara. That's the last of our questions for today. Any parting words before we say goodbye?
I would just say that, please, both the early childhood phase and the school age phase are available. We're here. We want practitioners and school district and providers and service coordinators and parents to reach out to us with questions, concerns, accessing community resources. That's what we're here for. And so please get the word out, share our information with other parents, other colleagues. We're really here to support our community.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for your time today. Thank you, Beth and Barbara. And everyone, have a great afternoon.
Great. Thanks, Laura.